Let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. My name is Hillary, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the New York Transit Museum. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Tonight's program is a book talk featuring Nick Bloom's 2023 publication, The Great American Transit Disaster. Now, if you haven't been to the museum, or even if you have, we hope you can plan a visit soon. We're located in downtown Brooklyn in a decommissioned IND subway station. We are now open from Thursday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can reserve tickets on our website. We also have a gallery and shop in Grand Central Terminal, and coming up next week, we're starting our holiday train show out there. If you'd like captions, please click on Captions at the bottom of your screen and select Show Captions. If you don't see that setting, you can click the three dots at the bottom of your screen, and you should see an expanded menu of options. We also invite you to keep your camera on if you feel comfortable. Please also feel free to use the chat to post questions and comments. There will be time at the end of the presentation for Q&A, and I'll be collecting questions as we go. Now, I am pleased to introduce our presenter tonight. Nicholas Bloom is a professor of urban policy and planning at Hunter College. He is the author of many books, including Public Housing That Worked, The Metropolitan Airport, and How States Shape Postwar America. He is a co-editor of the prize-winning Public Housing Myths and Affordable Housing in New York. And of course, he recently published The Great American Transit Disaster, and I'll add a link to the book in the chat in just a moment. Bloom is frequently interviewed and quoted extensively on housing and other topics in media outlets, including WNYC, the New York Times, CNN, and the Washington Post. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Nick, and please take us through some of your findings of your latest book.
All right, well, Hillary, thank you so much for inviting me. And I have to say that if I were to personally design an ideal museum, it would be the Transit Museum. I think it's one of the great American museums. So thank you so much for having me this evening. Hold on a sec. Okay, here we go. So tonight I'm going to talk about, it's a précis from a few chapters in the book about transit and its decline in most of the United States. And when I say an urban transit disaster, what am I talking about? Well, you can see it in this chart right here, the massive losses in ridership between the 1940s in particular and the 1970s. Just a massive drop off in streetcars, buses, and so forth. It was a real loss in capacity in the United States. And to understand what we mean by a disaster, right? We're going to talk about how we ended up in the situation we are today with weak and underfunded transit agencies, service reduction and limited service in most places, a failure to expand transit to match the growing regions, and a very small regional percentage of transit riders. And the book is really organized around the idea that this was not inevitable, that there were political choices that were made to disinvest in transit. And the asterisk there is because I'm not talking about New York. All right. Since we have people from all over, I just want to be clear that New York is not featured in this book, although I have a chapter in the state government book on the creation of the MTA, because I don't think it's a disaster. I think it's amazing that New York held on to as much transit as it did. And I do feature somewhat better stories of Boston and San Francisco in the book to show what makes a difference in avoiding the worst outcomes in transit. But let's go back to the disaster part. And I'm a Baltimorean, so I grew up in Baltimore and rode buses to school, city buses in the 1980s, for instance. And Baltimore is a very typical American city in a lot of ways, in that for far too long, its transit system was run by a privately owned, unsubsidized transit company. In fact, till 1970. And this was, you think, well, that's insane. We call it public transit. But of course, as many of you probably know, most American transit until the late 60s, early 70s was in private hands. It was in private hands way too long, is the argument of the book. So I'm going to take you on a little tour of what happened to transit in Baltimore, and you'll get a sense of why it wasn't inevitable. There were a lot of choices that led to the destruction of transit. Now, for the transit enthusiasts, I would like to point out that Baltimore used to have great transit. If we talk about 1900, even up to the 1940s, Baltimore had a very dense system, particularly in these central neighborhoods. So we're looking at a map of Baltimore here. This is the east side and the west side, and you can see the density of streetcar lines that ran through these very densely populated, row house, a little bit larger, maybe homes. And it was these neighborhoods, the east and west sides. I'm going to come back to them a lot because that's really where the infrastructure of transit was in New York or in Baltimore. I'm sorry. And there are these lines that extended out to these new suburbs, but these aren't to scale. It actually, um, there were large areas that had very limited coverage. But there was transit out there. And in sort of the story, which I talk with my students a lot about, that transit was a handmaiden of real estate development and definitely in Baltimore, there was a different kind of streetcar kind of neighborhood. The streetcar neighborhoods I'm showing here, pretty dense and so forth. But there was in the early 20th century a different kind of streetcar landscape of elite suburbia. And places like Homeland, Roland Park, Guilford, and so forth, these were comprehensively planned, wealthy, covenanted, all white neighborhoods that were linked initially, very conspicuously, with streetcars, sometimes running in their own dedicated lane for parts, and then later on with electric trolley buses. So you had basically two kind of streetcar cities. You had a dense urban core, and you also had a very low density streetcar suburb for the elite. This all kind of falls apart in the 1920s, or starts to fall apart with the first automobile boom. And so how does the auto boom affect transit in Baltimore? Well, as you can see here, you had all these streetcars in that central area, packing in, but now you had the automobiles. You can even see some of the little bit, there's a streetcar back in that image. But now you had all these automobiles, and Baltimore's downtown, like so many, was very compact. And so you had all these streetcars coming into the center. There really wasn't space for streetcars and all these cars. And then the other side of that is that these wealthy suburbs were designed with a streetcar running through them, but they were really pretty great for cars. And people had money. They were the first, early adopters of automobiles. And so they started abandoning streetcars in the suburban areas, and in the center city, the streetcars don't operate as well. They get slower. And actually, there were a lot of city residents who began buying cars too. So during the 1920s and 30s, there are choices that are still affecting us today. And you're following like zoning debates and things like that. You know about this. There were a lot of like anti-transit decisions that were made. So, today we're going after zoning, for instance, and a lot of, Baltimore zoning dates from the 1920s still, with very few changes. And zoning matters to transit because if you see up here, you have vast residential, relatively low density districts. And that matters. You have a private transit company in this period of the 20s, the United Railways. Look, they're looking at this and they're saying, we're not going to get a lot of customers, right? From these newly annexed areas of the city. It's going to be relatively low density residential. So they're looking at kind of like a maximum population that's, when you're collecting low fares, is not going to be that lucrative. The other side is, and I'm sure you're probably familiar with some of these redlining maps, but the other key in the 1930s in the interwar planning was that redlining, if you notice here, these central city neighborhoods, which I noted before, were the areas with the dense streetcar infrastructure. These are the redlined or yellow-lined areas, which had a growing African-American population and a mixed ethnicity, which basically the banks and so forth wrote off, right? They said, we don't think these areas merit investment anymore. Well, that's bad news for transit too. I think we can agree, because this is where their infrastructure was. This is where the transit lines were the most dense. And now the banking industry in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and after is saying these are areas that are no longer worthwhile for investment. So they will go through, I will show, they will go through massive disinvestment. And during this time, despite white resistance to integration and so forth, the Black population of Baltimore grew, particularly even before World War I, but during the interwar periods, during World War II. And as I noted, the areas where the Black population of Baltimore was initially quite concentrated were those east and west close-in neighborhoods where the transit was. Now, during the war, everyone had to get back on transit, right? And you notice this picture here, it's an amazing picture, which is also the cover photo. You have integrated transit in Baltimore, right? So for a few years during the war years, I mean, it was integrated before, but there was this sort of integrated moment of transit, and it's where it's transit's last hurrah, as in Baltimore, as in so many other American cities. So, but after the war, right, the white population, for reasons of basically, distaste for sharing integrated space, but also because of the opportunities that a system of housing, which was race oriented. The new highway systems, they were able to leave for the suburbs. So you have massive white flight, not only kind of from housing, but from transit, right? The other piece is that even within the city itself, the wealthier white population in this period, they began buying cars in large amounts. So ridership just plummeted in the post-war years, the late 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. You had massive loss of ridership. Now, it's not a central focus of the book, but there is the streetcar conspiracy addressed in the book. And I have a lot on this, but I just want to summarize that during this period, what was by then called the Baltimore Transit Company, had been reorganized in the 1930s, was taken over by the National City Lines, which was this, investment vehicle for about 40 transit systems nationally, including LA and Oakland and quite a few California cities, that basically was bankrolled in part by the automotive industries. And they do take over Baltimore's essentially bankrupt transit company. And they initiated a very aggressive program of streetcar substitution, of ripping out streetcars and then adding buses and so forth, having buses take their place. That's one part of their strategy for sure. The other piece was that because it was still a private company, as I mentioned, until 1970, it's under this BTC management. You have basically a private company trying to figure out like how to make a buck while offering this public service. And honestly, that was just as destructive. That's the argument of the book is like buses could have been okay if you kind of kept good buses, you kept good quality service. But what happens in Baltimore and almost every American city, whether it was under National City Lines, which was about 40 out of 1,200 systems in the country, was that the buses get underinvested. And buses are used not to create a better system over time, but to create less service. And then you have rapid fare increases because they want to profit. The cost of everything was going up. They reduce service over and over again. They defer maintenance, and they don't really expand at all to new growing suburbs. But where the streetcar conspiracy gets things, I think, a bit wrong is that when the National City Lines takes over BTC, the city was ready. The city leaders, they had already been anti-transit and frankly anti-streetcar since the 1920s, because almost all the emphasis of city leaders was like getting the tracks out of the streets, right? Speeding up automobile traffic. That was their goal. And so when BTC comes in, or when National City Lines comes in, they've got memos from City Hall saying, get rid of the streetcars fast. And every time they came up to the Public Service Commission, what was this guy right here, Henry Barnes, who was the traffic commissioner in the 50s, he would get up there and say streetcars are dangerous and they need to go and they slow down traffic and so forth. And so they were anti-streetcar at the entire period, in essence, when the National City Lines and its subsidiary, the BTC, was operating. So they pushed that. They did not step in when they saw the streetcar lines were being pulled out. They basically rejected public ownership until 1970. They watched this system decline. Everyone knew, including Mayor D'Alessandro and others, that the system was in decline. They didn't provide subsidies to a private company. Tough politically to do that, of course. And this is the even more amazing thing. They continued to pull significant park taxes. Like they tax this private transit company to support like park maintenance and other city needs. So what the streetcar conspiracy gets wrong is essentially, that NCL was definitely not big on buses. I mean, big on streetcars, but they were helped and they were encouraged by city leaders. And you can see this very clearly in Baltimore's premier post-war redevelopment project. This is Charles Center redevelopment, which you see here, which basically bulldozes the model, but bulldozed the whole sort of large section of the business district of the center of Baltimore and replaced it with these modern towers, we call it urban renewal, with some parking underneath it and so forth. And this was in the early 60s. And one of the requirements that the city set for doing this project was the elimination of the last two really quite good streetcar lines from Baltimore. The BTC had actually kept a couple of the really good, what were called trunk streetcar lines, but man, they wanted them gone, and because they went through this site, okay? And these streetcars were really interesting because they went from Towson in the north the suburban areas, one of the few ones that went down York Road and went through the city center and then went out to Catonsville on the west side, which you see here. So they could have been upgraded. I mean, there were so many opportunities, and there were people who called for this, but the city leaders were like, no, we don't want they're going to slow down traffic. We're putting all these one-way streets. They were big on, Henry Barnes was big on one-way streets. We got to get them out of there to speed up traffic. And we're going to put in these like high pedestrian overpasses. The streetcars will be in the way. So they forced BTC to remove the final streetcars in 63. So that's kind of late actually for streetcar removal. So they actually had kept those all the way. But in spite of all this like anti-transitism, there were still riders. And, the BTC and almost every American transit company didn't like to talk about race, right? When in their things like, oh, ridership is down, or we're doing, we're trying to get more riders. Okay. But they didn't talk about the demographics. But what you can see here from this chart, right, is here's the African-American population in Baltimore in 1960, and here is ridership in 1960. And you can see that it aligns, not entirely, but pretty closely with the African-American population, which was, on the whole, in this period, a lower income, a more transit dependent than a more mobile and highly subsidized white population leaving the city. So there still were riders. In 1960, they could have been served, for instance, with high quality bus service. But again, we had to say, so why didn't this happen, right? And it's because, in part, the city leadership at this time, which was white dominated, and also the county leadership, took a whole bunch of steps to undermine the competitiveness of transit, and also the neighborhoods where transit had been best served. So we look at highways, for instance, and this gives you a little feeling for the Beltway system and the Jones Falls Expressway highway, plans for an east-west expressway. They had a lot of plans. Here's the east-west expressway route. So this undermines transit in the sense that for people who had cars, including a growing African-American middle class by the 1960s, the highway network was far more comprehensive, modern, and rapid than like the remaining streetcars or the buses that were on offer. So it's sort of like unfair competition, I guess I would say. But the other thing is it was extremely destructive to African-American neighborhoods. So now we're on the west side of Baltimore with the famous Highway to Nowhere. And it was Highway to Nowhere because the residents of the city finally in these neighborhoods finally stopped its kind of its connection as a full east-west route. But look at the damage, right? Hundreds of homes removed and so forth to do this. And this also is typical in America, the creation of, while they're saying, oh, transit can't be subsidized and blah, 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 and letting it go downhill and ripping out streetcars and so forth, what they're doing at the same time is building a system of transportation that is almost always faster than transit and also was extremely destructive to neighborhoods that had transit. And all you have to do is look at your Google Maps, in most American cities and see which one is faster, jumping in a car or getting in transit. But it's even more grim, I'm afraid, than that, because it wasn't just that they built highways in these neighborhoods on the east and west sides, the transit-rich neighborhoods with the denser population, but they also set to work on neighborhood urban renewal. It wasn't just downtown, but almost every American city had a kind of program of destruction to basically clear neighborhoods and basically redevelop them, like for, you see here, hospital expansion or other kinds of civic projects. So white city leaders in this period were totally dedicated to basically clearing and de-densifying neighborhoods that were transit rich and also very densely populated. And these are the kinds of projects that followed, right? These are not necessarily terrible neighborhoods for transit, but in terms of density, they're not as good as what was there. And the net result in places like West Baltimore was of these kinds of policies, plus what I showed you before, the redlining and disinvestment, was massive population loss, right? Vacancy rates. You can see here lots of empty spots. Here's your highway. There's various kinds of redevelopment projects. And what really happens over time is that also the African-American population will leave. This is the famous black butterfly, will basically leave these neighborhoods too and become, quite frankly, much more car dependent, right, in the post-war years. There was an opportunity to maybe do better. The city leaders were interested in transit of a very particular kind. You also see this in every American city. They're like, we're not into streetcars. We're not into buses. Really, what we want is rapid transit. That was the first phase, right? This sort of high speed New York style, transit. And, they had these very elaborate plans at first. It really was about when they were doing regional, they created these regional transit agencies. And the regional transit agencies were very often like disproportionately representative of suburban areas. And, what did they want? They wanted, if there was going to be transit, they wanted transit, that took suburbanites to this, Charles Center downtown, right? And so that was they could get both state and federal funding to basically build a portion of this kind of rapid transit. But it was very focused on suburb to central city, which is a problem we have now with these lines. It was about speed. It was about really creating a modern image of a city, not necessarily serving the riders. Again, it's not to say that Baltimore did build one section of this rapid transit, and in fact, it does go through for most of it what is increasingly African American neighborhoods, but it was of limited utility because, again, people are working all over, right? Where does this line go? Downtown. Then, eventually they'll extend it to the Hopkins Hospital, which made sense. But this was an extraordinarily expensive capital project. And then in a few decades later, they hatched plans for light rail in the 1980s and 90s. And if you see this light rail line, like most American cities, light rail they used mostly an old railroad corridor, and then they have it go through the downtown. Well, there wasn't a lot of population density along this disused railroad corridor. And then in these northern sections, you had like a lot of wealthier people. And, they even fought having like a stop, in a fancy area called Ruxton. So you do have post 1970, when you have public ownership, the emphasis was on like, let's get those suburbanites, the wealthier people back on transit, even though they're really not the riders anymore. And it's one of the reasons why we have really a lag time between the return to transit on like rail versus buses at this point. And here's just a little bit of a picture of what if you destroy neighborhoods and you build highways and you redline neighborhoods and you disinvest in transit, this is kind of what it looks like. 1960, you can see the dense ridership, which I showed you before, and then you can see 2000, right, with these losses, particularly in these neighborhoods that I'm talking about. Now, yeah, it's a little bit along that subway line, but still, look at this tremendous loss of ridership. Okay, that looks, I know that's not great looking, but how about a similar city, Atlanta, right? I mean, this is even more, again, very similar pattern, demographic pattern, close in African American neighborhoods, that whole kind of process, private company disinvestment, 1970, public takeover. What do they want to build? Rapid transit. Well, did rapid transit work in getting people back to transit? It certainly doesn't look like that. So you say, well, let's do public ownership. So a couple of my chapters are about early public unsubsidized transit. And, this has a lot of lessons for today, because what we're finding out, right, is that public ownership does not necessarily, well, we kind of knew this, but certainly post-pandemic, we knew that public ownership that doesn't have the cash, right, things do not go well. And so I tell two stories about Chicago and Detroit about the losses and the problems with public ownership that is not subsidized. So, Chicago had like probably one of the greatest transit systems ever built. Its surface line system, which eventually was consolidated under single ownership, the Chicago surface lines, unbelievable. You can see here, stretching, north, south, east, west, amazing system in the early 20th century. And you can see one of the cars here. And what's really interesting is that the neighborhoods, grew up around the streetcar lines, and also the elevated, which you see here. They also had high-speed elevated lines. So you really had a whole city that was, built up around transit. So that's awesome, right? That seems like a very good base to build on. But there are a number of problems that emerge pretty quickly with transit, even before there is a full public ownership or takeover. So like in Baltimore, even before World War II, you have auto-centric planning, all right? And this, if you look at the Chicago suburbs, which very often had rail service, they zone themselves, like elite places like Winnetka and even less elite places, zone themselves at very often low density rates, which means that that's going to limit your future ridership, on commuter rail, for instance. So that was typical in Chicago and so many other cities. Then, even before World War II and then after, there were massive plans for highways, right? So it's the same thing. What kind of network are you creating, right? There's going to be a highly subsidized road network starting in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s, even before the Interstate Highway Act, that's going to create a regional highway network that's like super fast compared to transit, even elevated lines, right? You can go point to point with your car in a much more rapid way. And you can see, automobile ownership, right? As you get out right here about 1960, right, in these areas. So the big problem in Chicago was that when they created the CTA, the Chicago Transit Authority in 1946, basically taking the by the 1940s, the surface transit and the elevated companies were operating because of the war. They'd had some good ridership, but they were functionally bankrupt in essence. And basically the city took over those lines and merged them into what became the CTA in 1946. The problem was they said, okay, we're going to take over transit, but it's got to pay its own way. Wow. Right? Here you have like a money losing industry, right? And somehow it's got to pay its own way. So how is that going to work? And so the new public ownership of transit, now you don't have any national city lines here. Hold on, I've got fire trucks going by here. You don't have national city lines involved, but the public ownership in Chicago said, okay, we're not getting city subsidies. We're getting some tax relief. And we're not getting state subsidies. There's no federal role. How can we save money? So they looked around. They said, well, what are our big capital costs? Oh, streetcars, right? That's massive. And, there hadn't, because the Chicago surface lines and the elevated lines had not really invested much in the 1920s and 30s. They were looking at suburbanization, even and automobile ownership in Chicago too in the 20s and 30s. You had a lot of deferred capital needs. And so, they basically said, well, that's a big cost factor. So let's get rid of the streetcars. And by 1958 in Chicago, this is what you see here. The last streetcar was running like as a celebration. Let's get rid of them. No national city lines. But, what is the goal? The goal is to cut costs, to basically pay as you go. You have to pay your way. And streetcars were very expensive, especially because after World War II, you had this massive, as in Baltimore and so many other cities, as people were buying cars, you had massive ridership losses. There were limitations on how much fares could be raised. And they looked around at high capital costs and they decided that they could right size their system with buses. Now, again, as in Baltimore, buses could have been all right. There were opportunities to have high quality buses. And when Chicago first did its bus replacements in the 50s, it used propane buses, which were innovative and interesting. But eventually, there were reliable, diesel buses and so forth. The problem is that even after they'd gotten rid of the streetcars, they still couldn't balance their books. Declining ridership, raising costs, it was unionized eventually, and, they couldn't keep up with their costs. And so then it was time to cut bus service. And this is where like the book gets very sad, because Chicago used to even when they transferred to buses, they used to have really good buses. Overnight service was excellent, weekend service. So they started cutting all that, right? A lot of overnights, what it was called owl service, they would cut that. And over time, there was a tremendous loss of quality for the riders. Again, because they're not, subsidized, they did very limited expansion. They got a little bit of help from Chicago, the city of Chicago, because they turned over right away. For instance, on the west side, they did do one of the few median median transit lines in an expressway. So that was kind of innovative for its time. But just like the private company, the public company is looking at, the outer parts of the city of Chicago. They're looking at the suburbs and they're like, yeah, there's not looking like we're going to get a lot of riders out there, right? So why would you, they're not really honestly very credit worthy, honestly, too. So, they couldn't expand to build a quality service on a much larger scale that would have been needed. So you can see the mass transit in 1956, the transit is very concentrated and the region is really expanding. And again, in Baltimore, maybe that would have been okay at some level, except that the city leaders, primarily white in this period too in Chicago, decided that the neighborhoods that had a lot of transit needed to be rebuilt, disrupted, and so forth. And you can see an elevated line here on the south side and redeveloped with either moderate density public housing or really very low density um, middle income urban renewal projects. And you can see there, I mean, like the parking and so forth, and just these, vast fields. So again, they're basically disrupting, as in Baltimore, these near in transit oriented neighborhoods, even when the transit infrastructure was there, right? So that's not going to help your transit. And as in Baltimore, the long-term impacts of things like redlining and housing discrimination and so forth led to, disinvestment in neighbors like here's Englewood at its height and here it is in decline, basically led to white flight from neighborhoods, reducing density, disinvestment in neighborhoods, again, of African-American families also will leave these neighborhoods if possible because they are being so aggressively disinvested in. And you had a lot of, sort of elevated lines or other kinds of infrastructure in these neighborhoods that now will be underutilized. And people of color, they saw where things were going, right, and began to decentralize. As I mentioned, on the south side of Chicago, the west side, particularly the south side, the African American population is moving into better quality housing that's being abandoned. And you think, well, that's great. I mean, it is good. Unfortunately, those were also areas that tended to be further from like the rail lines, or if there were rail lines, they were like an electric commuter rail type system on the south side that was more costly to use. So you had longer bus rides, right? So one of the knock-on effects, right, of disinvestment was moving the riders away from the neighborhoods where there was transit. And you can see also this with the Latino population of Chicago, this westward expansion, actually out into the suburbs, right? For a while, and even today, I mean, the Latino population is an important part of CTA's transit picture. But again, that population also sees, the suburbs and other areas which have very little transit, some limited bus service, some limited commuter rail as the place to live. And so abandonment of transit has become kind of built into the landscape of a place like Chicago. Now, there's still transit. Chicago's not the worst case necessarily in the US. And I think early public ownership helped in some ways. But you can see here, pretty clearly the thinning out of ridership on the south side of Chicago and even a bit on the west side. The north side is a more densely populated, not entirely white, but certainly whiter part of the city, which had strong connections to the central business district. And also the CTA emphasized renovating the rapid elevated lines as a way of kind of keeping people kind of accentuating the central place benefits of the downtown. Okay, but Chicago compared to Detroit, all right? Detroit, public ownership starts about 1922 of transit. So you think, well, that definitely is not the solution. Like, unsubsidized public transit. This is what happens, Again, why? Why in Detroit? Well, same factors, right? Redlining, you have a creation of a highway system that's unbelievable. You have a public system that is not able to pay its way and just cut over time. Destabilization of close-in transit neighborhoods. And I mean, that I think, shows you what, and by the way, this kind of portrait is what we could be looking at in a lot of American cities, because even though American transit is subsidized, we all know that it's insufficiently subsidized, right? And if it's insufficiently subsidized, that's the same in some ways as not being subsidized at all, in the sense that you have to do just massive cuts. And so many agencies are facing this today. Well, I don't want to leave you with a sense that there was no option. There was a public option that had more, gas to it, I guess you would say. And these are early public subsidized systems in cities like Boston, New York, and San Francisco. And as I mentioned, my earlier book on state government dealt with the MTA in New York, but this book has chapters on Boston, San Francisco as better outcomes than most American cities. And I know what you're going to say about Boston and so forth, but I consider those to be short-term problems in Boston, as opposed, because they save so much transit. So Boston and San Francisco are definitely considered some of my better models. So do these cities have some of the same structural issues as other American cities, right? So, is there a worthwhile comparison there? And they do. Um, was there urban renewal in Boston? Oh yeah, look at this, the West End. Oh my God, I mean, this is just unbelievable, right? Or did they have big highway construction programs, right? Here's the Central Artery. I mean, just awful, right? So they had these kinds of programs. Did they have redlining? Oh yeah, right. In Boston for sure. Did you have suburban areas with lot limitations, the zoning that was sort of anti-transit? Yeah, so you have a lot of kind of like the underlying similarities in terms of public policy, but there are differences that make a difference. All right. So I do tell a more pro-transit institutional history for a city like Boston. So what are some of the factors? Well, you have which I'll talk about in more detail, but you have regional development of rail, or at least the goals of regional development of rail. You have regional subsidies, which are crucial to sustaining transit through its most difficult times. You have state subsidies of transit, which have been crucial, right? Through means like these subsidies, they were able to keep fares relatively low over time and thus not lose as many riders. There was a lot of citizen activism, which basically saved a lot of transit. And through these means, they were basically able to um, hold on to much more service. And could be service in buses, it could be service in trolley buses, it could be service in elevated lines. I mean, it's just like, the rolling stock of Boston is sort of like a transit museum itself, right? It's unbelievable, right? And so, but, keeping all that there in spite of it being aging and having problems, right, has a major impact on people's decisions about where they're going to live. Can they rely at some level on transit and so forth? So the regional history is really interesting. Well, to me, it's very interesting. But it's a very early story where, in essence, the private companies that were running transit, they they went broke basically in World War One, a little bit after, and they basically went into a trusteeship. And this trusteeship, which began in 1918, was a form of public supervision and control that led to the first kind of regional taxes on transit in that area, and basically collected from a variety of different communities. And what you can see here on this little interesting map, right, is Boston is relatively small, and so transit really from the 19th century into the early 20th century was already built essentially across municipal lines. So it was already kind of like a regional entity because all the little towns and cities and so forth in the Boston region are small, so they already cross those lines. Like these elevated lines and things like that would cross lines. So that was kind of baked in. And then there also was, streetcar extensions, and you had the famous streetcar suburbs that Sam Bass Warner described. They were also transit-oriented areas, and Cambridge is a separate city, but shared in streetcar, dependence and development. So you had a kind of the form of transit in Boston was regional to begin with. So when they create these trusteeship, it's already got a regional flavor. It's state authorized, and they begin taxing regionally. Right now, Boston pays the biggest amount because it had the most transit, but there's already this principle established extremely early, which, by the way, 100 years later, we're still fighting for in most American cities, that there be regional transit taxation, right? So forth. So that was an early important thing. And then in the succeeding public entities, which are creating the MTA and the MBTA, you have basically the continuation and in some cases expansion of this regional vision to other areas further out and so forth. But it was really crucial that in 1918, they pulled off this amazing trick of regional taxation. But that probably wouldn't have been entirely enough. The other key element, compared to a Baltimore, which just had a little section of highway, and there were a couple sections that were canceled, but it really wasn't much. They mostly built the highway and road network they wanted, and most American cities did. Boston had a much more extensive road cancellation or highway cancellation that happened, and this was, in part again because you had a very strong civic dimension. You had a lot of affluent white people living in places like Brookline, which were threatened with additional highways, or Cambridge and areas like that, who were still, they weren't transit users. They were like sometimes professors who were like planners, and they basically fought successfully to stop some of the worst of these lines. And that really matters. Highway cancellation is crucial. And it's crucial, for instance, in New York, because our highway network ultimately wasn't as big as Robert Moses wanted. It's crucial in San Francisco, which had the most in the 1950s of highway cancellation, because what it means is that it's awful to drive. It's in Boston. Have you lived there? It is. It's just terrible to drive. And so there's a competitiveness of transit that really matters. Okay. Because the roadways are so bad. So again, there's a lesson there. Like, the worse we make it for driving, the more people will probably ride transit. I think there is a deep truth that Boston shows in this. All right. So I think that's important. And the other factor is you're not destroying as many neighborhoods, right? So these are unbuilt. And so you're kind of leaving that density of development there. So again, that density is an important thing. You have much more comparative density in the Boston area. This is kind of a luck element too. You have the universities are really crucial with students as riders. They're important. And you have affluence very often near transit. And that's sort of permanent. You think about Brookline is its own city, the city of millionaires as it was known, and has these little streetcars running through it to this day. They had an interest. There was still maybe enough riders, or its maintenance was important. And so those are kind of luck elements that are really crucial, but you could recreate that, right? With the rezoning and the ending of parking minimums. There are lessons here, right? Again, the worse you make it to store a car, the more you can build people, into neighborhoods, the importance there. The other thing, which I've kind of been hinting at, right, is that unlike a Baltimore, Chicago, you definitely, until, a few decades ago, you had a pretty large white majority population in a lot of areas that had transit. Some of them were still riding transit, or you had the white students and so forth. The African-American community was relatively small. And so transit remained, there were more white riders on transit than a city like Baltimore much longer. And then post 65, like San Francisco and New York, Boston really diversifies with a lot of people coming from all over the world. And they're kind of like, oh, I know transit. Transit's okay. It's not the worst thing I've ever heard of, or I don't have enough money for a car right now. I'll ride transit. And so the diversification of Boston neighborhoods has definitely been a factor in transit's preservation and ridership over time. And what we see are a series of plans never really achieved, but this regional vision, they're always making like a lot of promises they can't keep about, like, we're going to serve this suburb better. There's going to have like amazing rapid transit go everywhere. And okay, they didn't do that. They're still waiting for like electrification of most of the commuter rail, et cetera, et cetera. But they did save they did save and augment the commuter rail system on a regional basis. There were some key extensions post-war, which were pretty rare for, rapid transit and so forth. So they did deliver on some of that regional expansion and kind of created a system, if you will. It looks more unified than it is if you've ever used the T, but they did create a system to allow people to travel on a regional basis. And then, they preserved like everything, so much of the system. So again, streetcars, and until recently trolley buses, and also some old trains and things like that, which are now slowly being repaired. But that is just in such stark contrast to a city like Baltimore, right, which replaced its surface transit, its rail, and and even its electric trolley buses with buses, and then didn't maintain that service. Boston, despite all of its many problems, and the MBTA has quite a few, right, but compared to most American cities, preserve more service, preserve more of the kind of built infrastructure of transit, and as a result, and then expanded more, I think, than most American cities. As a result, it is definitely more transit oriented than most American cities. But I just want to be clear that in the Boston region, still most people do drive, but there is on offer more transit, and that is mostly because of subsidies, right? Subsidies are crucial. And you can see here a 1960 and 2000 map showing relative stability. I should be clear that this looks better than it does. 1960, there's already been massive losses to ridership in a city, a region like Boston. So, it looks really good by 2000, like, oh, they've done everything right. But in fact, 1960 was already significantly lower. Well, that is a very quick overview of a few chapters and some information. Would you like to know more? I hope so. I encourage you to buy the book from the University of Chicago Press. And I should add, it comes in many different forms at this point. You can get, I think, a very inexpensive ebook. So you can listen to it. It's a PDF you can rent for $10. I mean, I definitely recommend the hardcover. It's a lovely book. And I guess that's it. I was a little faster than I thought, but I'm happy to talk questions now.
There we go. No, that was really amazing. Thank you so much for sharing this research and these pieces of your book. We definitely do have time for Q&A, so please feel free to add questions into the chat. There was a question that came up a little earlier. Maybe I could start with that. This is from Will earlier. He was asking if you could speak to the role, if any, of the forced divestment of streetcar companies from their parent electric utility companies. He said he thought this was...
Yeah, that's another error. I do discuss it in the book, which was this sort of anti-monopoly crusade, right? That so many of these streetcar companies, because they had been in the electric power generation business as part of their kind of like aligned, business thing, they had these electric plants, and they were forced because of a series of decisions in the 1930s to divest themselves of the profitable having Atlanta, for instance, the profitable part of their business, which was electric power generation, which they were selling more broadly. And, it was like great for anti-monopoly, but, it basically, they were only too happy to separate off the money losing, streetcar operation, like, bye-bye, that was God. And then they became successful power companies in some cases. So yeah, they're always, I think the book has a lot of like what I would say are like unintended consequences kind of components.
Okay, great. If there's any other questions, definitely feel free to add into the chat. Mostly just everybody thanking you for a great presentation.
Oh, cool.
Question, what are your thoughts on some of the fixes going into the future? I mean, is it very city specific?
Yeah, my thought, and I've written on this some, is you got to get the subsidies right. So, I mean, we're always looking, like, there's a lot of like transit enthusiasm, like transit tech, like transit hype, kind of things. And, I love BRT. I think that's neat. I think there's always like some, or, e-buses, right? There's like always some new, thing that's going to like save transit. But usually it's really not from the user perspective, right? It's like, what do transit riders want, right? And what will really bring people back to transit, like to believe in it, right? It's like, I think the big trends that are really good now are like, let's cut the headways. Let's have more buses, more times, some rail too. But, these like shorter headways. When you're a rider, honestly, I've ridden a lot of transit in my life, and I didn't really care how nice the thing was. It's some level, like, if it's a cold night in Boston or somewhere like that, you're like, yeah, that thing, I'll get on that thing. I'm not that picky, when I lived in Baltimore, the same, I was like, I was riding some of those old, like, 1960s, diesel buses, but I loved them because it was like, it's getting me where I wanted to go. So I think a lot of the emphasis needs to be, and there are people like Jared Walker and others who've done a good job on this, like core riders, how to make better bus systems. I think that's crucial. If BRT is part of it, great. But underlying all of it, right? It's got to be subsidized at a level where you have a kind of service that people can really depend on, like daytime, nighttime. It's really got to work for people, and that's who transit is for. And it can't work for ribbon cutting. A lot of different transit works for ribbon cutting. You just show up, it looks really nice. You cut the ribbon, and then what does it look like 5 years from now? Is anyone on it, right? So we have a lot of ribbon cutting transit in the US, which is like underutilized, like a lot of the light rail and other things like that. So I think concentrating on your core riders, the better bus movement is solid. BRT's nice, but again, subsidies, and there has to be a zoning rethink around transit too. But if you do a zoning rethink and you don't have good service, that's not going to work. People are just going to jam their cars into those areas.
I guess that kind of relates to a question somebody else was asking about congestion pricing and like other efforts to reduce reliance on the automobile or make it more difficult. Does that make a
Yeah,
difference?
I mean friction. I do. It's like anything that adds friction, right, to the driving experience will probably divert a certain number of people into cars. But the problem right now we have, right, is the reason New York's able to do congestion pricing right now is that actually the New York CBD has come back, right, than a lot of American cities. If you do congestion pricing in a lot of American cities, that's not really going to collect a lot of money because downtowns, they're coming back, but it could be something that doesn't work. Although I will say this, I think you could do like beltway congestion pricing, things like that. I mean, here's my feeling. I'm kind of agnostic on this. I, any tax that goes to transit, I'm for it. Like, you want to collect it, at a bunch of gantries, great. That works for me. You want to divert tolls. I mean, in New York, for instance, the MTA is a bridge and tunnel operator, and a portion of that money goes to support the MTA, right? That works. You can do, that's a great thing. I mean, there's so many ways to do it, but you could also just, instead of making this big public thing, right, where everyone fights over congestion pricing, you could just divert general revenues into transit, like tax, the local property tax and so forth. I mean, San Francisco's been using, basically, taxes to support transit. That's why they have trolley buses and, a lot more transit and a lot more service than most American cities. So, however you get the money, I'm for it. I mean, that's where we are now. I mean, it's pretty
Yeah,
grim.
it has to come from somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Somebody's asking, and I don't know what this is referring to exactly. Do you think TOD is
Yeah.
effective?
Okay, that's great. And I have my planning students, we talk about this a lot, transit oriented development. Yeah. Well, it can be. I mean, again, what I've talked about in Boston, there's a lot of like naturally occurring TOD, like dense development around transit. And Chicago has some of it too, despite all the bad choices they made. So it can work. From the and see Europe, there's tons of TOD in Europe that really works. So what do you need it to work? I mean, the problem we have in the US with TOD is we build all these apartment buildings with parking. So it's like, you'll see this in Jersey like a lot, like they have a great TOD program, but like these are like apartment buildings either surrounded by surface parking or like built on top of parking ramps. I don't know, and from the studies that have been done on this, doesn't really add up to a lot of riders, right? So I think if you're going to do TOD, it has to be done again with, eliminate parking minimums. But the other thing is you need transit to go like where people need to go, right? So if you do TOD and you just have like a train line that goes to the downtown and people aren't going to the downtown that much anymore, not going to be a lot of TOD, not a lot of, a lot of like ridership, right? I mean, that's it. So you need a good quality, how does TOD work? Well, it's sort of very easy to do good TOD, right? It's like high density development, high quality transit, limited parking. There you go. But that's pretty rare in the US. If we do TOD very often, it's like a bunch of apartment buildings near a stop.
Maybe a last question. Do you have any examples that you feel of a city that maybe has pulled too far away from public transit and then we're able to kind of reinvest or reinvigorate it in like a robust way?
Yeah, I thought about putting like Seattle has a pretty good reputation in this area. Portland too, Portland, Oregon, but definitely Seattle, and has come back from the brink. And LA's working on it, I guess. But Seattle really has had some real results from particularly their emphasis on buses, a high quality bus service, and also basically local investment bonds and sort of things like that. So they've really like deeply subsidized a high quality bus network. They're building a expanding light rail system, but the real magic right there is an extremely high quality articulated bus network, modern and nice. And I think that can work, right? And they also have kind of the geography that helps that with the sort of compression and the density.
Great. That's well. I mean, it's enlightening to think that there are fixes, that it's not just going in
Sure.
one kind of general direction.
Yeah, I
Oh,
mean, we another gas crunch. I mean, could happen, kind of looking like it might, I mean, there are some, if there's a massive shutdown in global oil production. I mean, there could be all kinds of things that would accelerate some of these trends. I will say, I think the trend lines for the potential of transit in the future are positive in some cities, the ones that have, gone after single family zoning, right? Have reparation type, programs to reinvest in disinvested neighborhoods, have programs of regionally funded or at least better funded transit than they had in the past. It could be done.
Yeah, and I guess with, a lot of the climate concerns, it's going to be something we should be investing in anyway.
Yeah, and it's looking like it's going to take a really long time to get enough people in electric cars to make a difference.
Yeah, way too many.
Transit does it really much faster.
Right. Okay, well, thank you so much, Nick. This was just an amazing presentation. It was really great to see the research and all the fantastic imagery, and you really told the story in such a engaging way. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your research. Let me just make a few kind of final announcements for the end of our meeting here tonight. I'll put the book link again in the chat in case you guys missed it. But just again, if you like to visit the museum, you can reserve tickets on our website. We are open Thursday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Here is a bunch of links in the chat. If you enjoyed this program tonight, please consider making a donation or becoming a member. That always helps keep our programs going. We hope you join us for some more upcoming virtual events. You can find those on our website. Our next program is going to be next Friday, November 17th at 2 p.m. We're having transit historian Andy Sparberg taking us on a tour of the 3rd Avenue elevated line, the last pieces of which were dismantled exactly 50 years ago. And of course, we still have a couple open slots in our 2nd Avenue subway art and transit walk on November 30th, and our last underground NYC tour of the year is on December 7th. So if you're in New York or plan to visit, consider adding these excursions to your plans and walking around the city with us. Big thanks to our sponsor, Con Ed, for supporting our virtual programs. Thank you again, Nick. Thank you all for coming and joining us, and have a great weekend, everyone. We'll see you all next time.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Hillary, for having me there.
It was a pleasure.